populating rural areas, governance and rural gender relations. So Bettina is here today to talk about reappraisal of nexogenous development. Thanks very much for coming. And we also have two ESRs, Colm, Stockdale and Frederica, Ammaturo, that will kick off the discussion after Bettina's talk. Bettina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vasilis. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Also because it gives me the occasion to reflect and reconsider what I have done and thought and written about rural development. I've done research on rural development for, I think, almost 30 years now, mostly in Europe, but also in other parts of the world, among others by way of PhD students in Uzbekistan, in Korea, in Japan, in Africa, so in many parts of the world. But most of my work is in Europe. And whereas I was always a huge fan of endogenous rural development, in the years I developed some doubt, also by experiencing by doing a lot of research in the north of the Netherlands, which are our peripheral regions. And what you see is that particularly the most marginal rural areas have profited little from endogenous rural development research. And I thought about that, and my ideas around exogenous development, I think it's already 7 years ago that I talked about that, were a first step in that direction. And now I will tell you a little bit about that, and also where I stand now. Let's see, what's this page down here? So what I want to talk about today is what are rural development issues today in Europe, how can we understand them theoretically, how does policy respond, and what is the role of civic initiatives and collaborative workspaces. To be honest, I don't say a lot about that in my talk, but after the excellent explanation yesterday by Vasilis, I think I know a couple of them. I always had a different idea about it, but when he was talking about creative hubs and everything, I know a couple of them. And then coming to the end, what does it mean for nexogenous development? So if we look into rural development into the past, one of the things that since modernization and industrialization, the idea of the rural exodus was shared, or was seen as almost natural. And I could imagine also here. So when industries closed, people moved away, or when agriculture became mechanized, a lot of people moved into industries in the city. What we have seen in the last decade is an accelerated rate of urbanization, and even what we also call metropolization. So it's not only the growth of cities, but it's the massive expansion of cities, incorporating lots of rural areas. And what we have seen, I think that's somewhere in the 90s, was that now more than 50% of people actually live in urban compared to rural areas, which differs, by the way, a lot across the world. What we have also seen in the last 100 years, a process of differentiation. So as I said, with the course of urbanization, a lot of rural areas have been eaten up by cities, disappeared, have been incorporated. Some rural areas, in particular around cities, have become urbanized by counter-urbanization, so urban people moving into the rural areas close to the city, and the expansion of rural lifestyles. In a lot of these cases, they became also gentrified. And we have seen other parts of the rural areas becoming very marginal and peripheralized. And this, I would say, has become even more pronounced in the last 5 to 10 years. Some even talk about urban colonization. This is a picture from during COVID from Wales. I think you come from Wales.
I'm from Snowdonia.
You know, I think it's a beautiful poster. But actually, what they try to get to keep people out of Wales, because what we have seen is that people from the cities moved into the rural areas, which were experienced as more safe, offering more room, And in that course, they also brought the virus into the rural areas. So at some point during the pandemic, the virus was everywhere, but a couple of rural areas have experienced this coming in of colonizing by urban residents, trying to, as a rural refuge, it has also been discussed. In Greece, by the way, also during the crisis, the rural as a refuge. We see, in particular in the Netherlands at this moment, where we have a serious lack of housing, that people buy houses in nearby rural areas, moving into the rural areas, pushing prices up because they can spend a lot of money. And in that sense, also newcomers coming in, changing the rural areas, gentrifying the rural areas, with houses becoming unaffordable for people living originally in these rural areas. And I think we can also tourism and digital nomads consider as colonizers in certain parts of the world, beautiful parts of the world where they can live cheap and can work, do their well-paid work from very cheap places, beautiful places in the world. And in France, we just had a discussion about France. There are several places where I used to go to the Lot, and in the Lot is down the Dordogne, we find many English refugees buying houses, starting bed and breakfast, where French people move away because they cannot find a job. So we get a weird kind of dimensions also in this urban-rural relation. At the same time, we see the emergence of what is also called inner peripheries, particularly popular in Italy, where we see that their inner areas, and in Italy it's literally the inner areas become depopulated with mainly aging people remaining. And in some of these areas, and I think that is also the case in Italy, where we see migrants and refugees moving into these inner peripheries. So they are inner because they are in Italy, it's literally the core of the country. We see the same in Spain. In the Netherlands, it's at the margins of the country, at the border. So it's more the border peripheries than the inner peripheries. But it's also very wisely used in Italy is the inner areas are the core of the country. So the core of the country is becoming empty, is becoming marginal. And what does that mean for a country if there is a core that is losing wealth? They are inner peripheries, so as I said, also politically, maybe culturally, in the sense of how they are looked upon, with very little investment in housing and services, the disappearance of employment, and also the rise of a feeling of abandonment. We have seen that, it has been described for the United States, but we see that happening also in Europe. And I will come back also to the Netherlands, where that is also quite extreme. And many of those areas, of the rural areas, it's not necessary, I think socio-demographically and socio-politically are really the same areas. When it comes to ecological peripheralization, that are partly the same, but not necessarily. But in many rural areas, we see that climate change, drought, or too much rain is undermining their primary economic activities and the quality of life. And that is certainly true for the core of Spain, where we had temperature above 45 degrees in summer. I wasn't there, but but I was in France, and in France it was quite hot as well. I don't know if you have know about the long-term vision of the rural areas. It's a recent initiative of the European Union, which tries to develop a new vision for rural areas, but also tries to push the European governments to invest in rural areas. And in this long-term vision of rural areas, you see all these problems that I was identifying reappearing. Loss of services, loss of employment, the need for newcomers, for people coming in, also in farming, problems around poverty, problems around climate change, and a call for innovation, digital and social innovation. And to social innovation, I will come back. It's an ambitious policy in difficult times. And I will say a little bit about the Netherlands. I don't know if you have seen it in the newspapers, but we had lots of violent protests, in particular by farmers who were opposing a new policy which tries to fight the too high nitrogen emissions, and calls for, in some areas, up to 90% less animals. And it's really necessary, I think, to change Dutch agriculture, but the way it was communicated was experienced as really, how do you say, a blow in the face of farmers. And it combines with the feeling of abandonment among rural residents. So what we see now in some rural areas, we have seen that in the United States when the national flag was turned upside down. I don't know if you have that symbol also in other countries. They did it also in the Netherlands. And I think it's in the Navy, it's like a cry for help, but it's also an indication of the loss of faith. So we see this turning around, because normally the red has to be upside, along streets in rural areas. So it's not just farmers, it's also a lot of rural residents, and also all kind of people who feel let down by the government, also around COVID, getting on the same wagon. And this particular party, which calls itself the Farmer Resident Movement, presents itself as the rural party. And is really, at the moment, it's about 16% of the seats and about 10, in some areas up to 20, 30% of votes. And we have regional elections coming up in March. So there is fright about this. And they are pro-industrialization, quite conservative. It's a weird mixture of political standpoints, but they're one of those, at least populist parties. Rural extremists is maybe too much, but populist there for sure. And what they point, and so we can argue about their political program, but what they do very cleverly is using this feeling of abandonment, identifying the danger of a loss of social cohesion, and also the stressed relations between the government and the residents. So they're very cleverly using that. And we have seen that, of course, also in other parts of the world. So what I would like to argue, and I will come to the importance of relations also later on, is that we see what is at stake at the moment in rural development is tension in relations between urban and rural areas, but maybe even more between government and citizen, between urban and rural lifestyles, and between nature and agriculture. It's also used like that politically. That is very clearly the case in the Netherlands, but in many other parts of Europe for sure, and maybe also other parts of the world, with increasing concern about exclusion at the social and territorial level, and return of what I would say core periphery dynamics in Europe, and frightening political effects. And not all of the effects have to do with the rule, but a lot has to do with the loss of faith and the loss of trust in the government. And I'm not an expert in Italy, but I would argue that in Italy, loss of faith and loss of trust has also to do with the recent outcome, the outcome of the recent elections. And I think that is frightening, and really, personally, I'm frightened by what is happening in politics right now. But how can we understand these issues theoretically, coming back to more safer grounds? A lot of these problems have existed for a very, very, very long time. They are not new, but maybe they became more significant. And what we see certainly now is that a lot of the problems are not originating in rural areas. They are very much related to crisis elsewhere, to developments elsewhere. The financial crisis, the political crisis, the ecological crisis. All that interacts very clearly with what is happening in rural areas. And of course, the effect of the Ukraine war on food prices, you can see it immediately. But for the other issues, that is true as well. We also see that what is happening there and how it should be addressed is not just in interest of rural areas, No, we need to deal, for instance, with climate change, not just for the rural areas, it's in global interest. And what is happening in rural areas, what is happening in agriculture, will be crucial for fighting climate change. So I think all these are indications of what is happening around rural development cannot be understood on its own, has to be considered as an interlinked, related issue. As I said in the beginning, I was a firm believer in endogenous development, and it's not that I lost faith, but I started doubting. And this idea of rural development is born from within, by way of community engagement, locally specific and participatory, has been cherished by many. But at the same time, we see this idea, which has been already quite some time ago, and Rokopis brought up that development actually is aspatial, becomes very prominent as well. Aspatial in the sense that it's not born in a particular place, but resulting from the interaction of networks, of places. And if rural development is aspatial, then the unit of our analysis cannot just be a geographic place, a specific place. We have to consider the place in its network and in the dynamic of the network. And if development is aspatial, then resources cannot be just endogenous or just exogenous. It's actually also then the network position defines the access to resources. And a lot of places are not, and a lot of people are not so linked to one particular place anymore. Look at us. We're moving around, meet in various places. You do your research in other places that you came from, and in multiple places. And a lot of these places are linked. And actually, of course, we know that, and it has been theorized already a long time ago by Castell in his idea of the network society. Our places, we are all nodes in a network, live in different places, or are connected with people who live in other places immediately. We can be in multiple places at the same time. And of course, that's not true for everybody. There are people who are constrained to one particular place, but the world has become a network, and the network and the dynamic of the network is defining what places can do and cannot do. We know that these networks are dynamic. We also know that the networks differ in how dense they are, or how expanded they are, or how close to each other relations are. And this is like a moving picture. And it depends on where you are in this network, if you are at the core or at the margin, to how many other places you are related, and how your place emerges from that network position. So it is not just collaborated, because that was already in the neo-endogenous approach, but it's emerging from how the network itself moves. It's also flexible, continuously moving. And I would say, looking back at the many civic initiatives, I know many of the place-based initiatives are not just born in places, but are related to people who bring in ideas, who know people somewhere else, who bring in connections, who bring in money, who bring in support. So a lot of successful village initiatives are well connected, are not just in that specific local place. But what we also see is that so some villages are very, very capable to organize all kinds of initiatives, to organize, to cope with the loss of services, to maintain services, but there are also villages that do not do anything to confront developments, which do not come into action. And very often you can see that they differ in composition of the population, but by way, for instance, of the composition of the population, also differ in networks. Very often they are also at specific places, more isolated, either geographically or socially or politically. So networks matter a lot. The development is also relational in the sense of comparison, because you are highly developed or underdeveloped relative compared to other places. And what you see is places that are disconnected. This is a picture. This summer I was in Croatia, and there was this beautiful place, and I shared at the very first slide there was a picture called Groznan. Groznan was is a place which started to lose population after the railway connection that linked several rural places to harbor places and made them very successful trading places. And at some point in 1923, the railway was closed and all these villages depopulated. And a lot of them became, this is one of those places. But Groznan was considered as a place worthy to invest in, and they started a music school. They invited artists they could have the houses for opera, for theater. So it's really beautiful, but only 10 kilometers further on, you see this village. It was as connected to the railway, was as disconnected as the other one, but not invested in. And the one, Groznan, has about 800, 900 inhabitants. There are 40 there, living in houses next to a house like that. I was surprised also that here you can see very wealthy houses next to a house which is falling apart. I don't know how that is possible in this city. Here it's in between. So there are places that are considered worthy to invest in, and there are places which are not worthy to invest in. Many of those places are also places where people then disengage from, do not become active, might leave because their future is considered to be elsewhere. And what is a very interesting theory in this regard, and some of you might know it, is peripheralization theory by a German scientist called Colm. His theory is about the interlinkage between centralization and peripheralization. So if we consider development to emerge from development, you can see that some places profit and some places are, because investments are centralized there, and at the same time, and also at the course of that, other places lose development, peripheralize. And these places then become different in terms of their economic position, in terms of their social position, and in terms of their political position. And I underscore two processes, the dependency and stigmatization. So when the places, the central places invested in, which are generally the metropoles, are those that are rich, also in political power, they can decide whether or not other regions are invested in. So in order to receive investment, in order to receive finances, the peripheralized places are in the dependent position. And very often these places are also stigmatized, sometimes also stigmatized by the lack of civic initiatives. Why don't they become active like these other villages? Why don't they do anything? They should also develop themselves. Also, one aspect of this relative development. I always have to look for the So what he says is peripheralization should be viewed as a multidimensional process of demotion or downgrading of socio-spatial unit in relation to other socio-political units, one that can only be explained with reference to the interaction of economic, social, and political dimensions. Which also says that social exclusion as a consequence of that development is a social process, but also a spatial process, or also spatially expressed. So how does policy respond? A very quick, and many of you might know that, reconsideration of European politics, because in rural development, European politics, of course, are very important. What you see in the course of time is from directly after the war, when rural development equalizes actually investment in farming, a consideration of regions that lag behind an importance of investing in social cohesion, and also recognition of the importance that there shouldn't be too big differences between parts of Europe. And also, in time, a reorganization of governance, you could say. So from a very clearly top-down consideration of investing, modernizing agriculture, more and more a turn towards bottom-up development, endogenous development, or how it is now said, community development. Initially, with LEADER, that was an experiment, but in the course of time, this kind of policy became mainstream for all regions, rural, urban, and coastal. So overall, the idea is that community development is the way to go. And this idea of endogenous development that came up in the 1980s became dominant. And what you can see if you look into the quotes is that the vocabulary is slightly different, but the idea is still the same. It should be about local needs, about indigenous potential, about participation, local and community driven. Oh, that was not the, sorry. I went down to the end immediately. That was not the idea. How do I get back? Slideshow, but I don't see the
Last slide, you mean?
the last I used, yeah. No. Up. There's not a. Go here. Yeah, that's what I was looking for. No. Maybe a slideshow, and then from this slide, from current slide here. Okay. I think I was here. Yeah. Probably the first Cook Declaration, a lot of you might not remember. There was a second Cook Declaration not so long ago, and that is where it became, this idea of community-driven development became the dominant model, and it's still now today in the region, together with business. So everybody who wanted to learn something, they said, come to us, tell me what you want to learn, and I will arrange it. And they really very creative. They're expected, these kind of initiatives are expected to be locally driven and locally based and to be driven by residents. But do these kind of initiatives, this kind of social innovation, does it really need to be local? Does it need to be driven by local citizens? And I want to tell you about two examples which I find very exciting because they seem to initiate a different kind of movement which is more relational. And the first is an I think it's an association. I'm not totally sure what the, yes, because I'm a member. It's an association, and it's called Our Land. And what they do is you become a member, and then you can buy little pieces of land. Already for €20 you buy like, oh, somebody told me it's like a francobolli. What's a stamp, a little piece of land. But together, you get loads of land, and the idea is by people, and many of their members actually from cities, you can decide what to do with the land. It's literally our land, and we don't want the government anymore to decide on it. We don't want farmers to be the sole owners of the land, because 65% of the land is owned by the farmers. We want to own our land and decide then what to use it for. So they buy land and then try to find farmers who work in a nature-inclusive, often organic way, and start a different kind of agriculture. I find it a fascinating idea, revolutionary capitalist, but turning it around in the sense that you can indeed decide on what our land is used for. A similar association exists also in Germany, I know. And the idea is by becoming a co-owner of the land, so you're not the singular owner because you own it together with others, you can work directly on the regeneration of the landscape and biodiversity. And you can also block other movements. So they tried, they didn't manage in the end, but they raised a lot of concern and opposition against the start of a data center. So one of these huge things. And what they wanted is they wanted to try, the municipality had already decided to sell the land to Google to start this data center, and there was a lot of opposition, and they didn't manage, but they wanted to buy the land from the municipality to block that development. But so you can see that they really try to become a political actor. And it's about, it's not local, it's not about local land, it's people from everywhere in the Netherlands who buy land together with others to make together decide that the land, some land will be used in a different way that is more conform to the conservation of the soil, biodiversity, and climate change. This is what they tried to, that is the place where they tried to block the data center, and this is where they tried to conserve a piece of land which is now used for urban gardening, and the city wants to build houses. And they also try to buy that land to oppose that development. Clearly a civic initiative, but not local, but concerning rural areas. The other example is more local. It's two farm women who started this activity also in the north of the Netherlands, where they try to find new ways to maintain their farm. So what they say is, what they say, I produce food, okay, but I produce many more values. I also maintain landscape, I also organize activities for children, and all these values are not paid for. And what they are organizing is not just interaction, it's the dynamic of the relation. And rural development, because rural development is not produced in places, the problems settle in places, but the problems are produced elsewhere. And they are part of this dynamic of centralization and peripheralization. And although initiatives can mitigate the effects and play a very important role, they on their own are unable to maintain vital rural areas. And in order to understand what is happening, we have to zoom in and zoom out, and we have to unravel this moving relational web. Thank you for your interest.
Thank you.
I have actually also a present for you, because it was our anniversary. Actually, it was last year, 75, but because of COVID, we had it this year, and we produced a book, and a lot of what I was telling you is based also in a chapter in the book, a reflection on rural development and place-based development. Here is the link, so you can download it, it's free, but I brought one for you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So let's begin with Colm and Frederica.
Thank you. Yeah, former collector. It's our land, it's our community. But that has never been done. So, and they, by way of their region, got money to hire like a mediator or a trainer who would help them, facilitator, that's the best word, to together organize discussions and a plan what then to do. Because it's not so easy. So they have shared interests, but not all interests are shared. And you need to figure out what that cohesion or co-living then means at the now at the very local level. Because at the national level, and I have been part of a commission about the use of land in the Netherlands, they talk about the rural areas as empty space and agricultural land. So here we can do this, and there is nobody living there. And I felt like this repeat, but there are people living there. Yes, there are people living there. Yeah, but they are farmers. No, they are not all farmers. There are all kind of people. They are the same people because it's farmers and people who very, very traditional ideas. I think there are lots of people. There are lawyers. There are accountants. They have construction firms. They have a shop. There are loads of teachers, nurses, etc. Just like in the city. Actually, the most agricultural workers are close to the Hague in the center because that's where we have horticulture. But they didn't know that, so there are very strange ideas on both sides. And I think we need to, and that's why I try to encourage this idea of this is our shared land. We need to, it matters to all of us what happens with the land, and we need to think about that, but in fairness, not in just deciding I will take this land, I will take that land. And of course this initiative of our land is maybe even colonization in the true sense of the word, because I buy the land and then use it as I want it to see, and that's true. But what it does encourage is this idea that it's our shared responsibility and also our shared, that we need to overcome this polarization or consideration. This is agriculture and this is city. When it comes to knowledge, yes, I think that differs a lot per country, probably. And per region and per sector, probably, because we have many highly educated farmers nowadays. Certainly in the bigger farms, in the very small farms, that might be different, and it might also depend on age. Sector, age, and region, I would say. What this agricultural innovation, AIP thing, whatever, agricultural innovation.
Yeah, I wrote it here. I forgot.
I've got the abbreviation, but it's like
agricultural innovation partnerships
or partnerships, exactly.
Yes.
That's what the European Union has organized, and actually in a way also it becomes mandatory for scientists to participate in those partnerships, because what they want to guarantee is that the scientific knowledge is shared directly. So in the sense of I have knowledge and I bring it there, but also in the sense of together with farmers discuss what kind of knowledge do you actually need. And the theory is perfect. I don't know how well it works in practice.
Yeah.
And I don't know how accessible it is for all farmers. What I know is that it's very inaccessible for women farmers. All agricultural training is very inaccessible for women farmers because it's very male dominated and also very technology dominated. So I think there is certainly a lot of improvement possible. When it comes to you as PhDs going into rural areas, is what I always find very important is to be very modest and not to come there as I'm the academic and I know what you need to do, but to come in a very modest mode and be interested in what is happening there, and also to bring gifts in a way. Try to understand if there is anything you can do in return, and that can be, and also to build up relations of trust, and that the things you can bring can be very small. And I remember when I was doing research among women farmers, and I met this farmer who was very defensive in the beginning and very distrustful, and then we got to talk, and I came back and I learned that she was very interested in conserving zucchini. So that was her hobby. Some rather recipes that I found. like finding this kind of personal connections, and that is a very individual example. Yeah, try to not only to bring your ideas, to ask what is it that you need, and I'm come here to learn, and that needs to be honest, of course, not just a way of doing. And because lots of people, in the end, they like to talk about what they experience, and many people are also, that is also, so there is this idea of marginal areas are horrible places to live, and we need to revitalize them, we need to change them, and it's very often the idea from the center, and they might even start, oh no, now I recognize that we need to, these poor areas, we need to help them. And then I said, okay, now I did it wrong, because it's beautiful places. It's what people love to live there. They're attached to the area very often. They're proud of what they have, even though they might recognize that something needs to change. So that is also very important to acknowledge and to support this pride and attachment. And maybe you can do something, but come from interest and curiosity, and then readiness to do something in return, I would say. I don't know if that answers your question.
Probably we have a lot of questions here, and probably the big questions are how hubs can be a part of this kind of place-based rural development processes, or how hubs can unleash social innovation processes and things. But I quite like the way that you approach, the way that in these rural areas there is hidden value, a latent value. However, I think that if you look at the history of capitalism, there is always the core that extracts value out of these peripheral areas.
But very selective value.
Yeah, physical resources, labor, and so on. And in the last few years, I think that, especially during the pandemic, we all wanted to go to rural areas. I mean, there are thousands of digital nomads coming to Greece to live in rural areas. So I'm wondering whether, if agriculture can be done as the way it was done in the 60s and the 70s, especially for Greece, because, we are not that competitive anymore to the market. So I think that if I look to the example of rural Greece, I think that these rural areas are becoming more and more spaces of consumption of the urban upper middle class, because it's not affordable. Working class cannot afford to go out there and spend a week or 10 days or 15 days. So I'm wondering whether this value-based approach can be somehow manipulated or handled by community economies, by alternative economies. And I'm not talking about putting an ethical dimension in it. I'm talking about how we can really give the power to people in villages to do whatever they want. I mean, to unleash their dynamics, to unleash their values in different ways and in relations with urban areas. Shall we take some comments or questions? I think there was Ilaria first and then Mikel.
Thank you very much. Your presentation was very, very interesting. I have just a few comments, and I mean, it's interesting what you said when you referred to Castle, so talking about the importance of networks. But if I think about my background, I'm an urban and regional economist, so I think that the networks develop in places, because in these places there is entrepreneurship. So I agree with you that the development is nexogenous. So you have an endogenous development, like in the industrial districts area, where you have entrepreneurship, you have the culture, you have trust and so on, and their networks are easier to develop. Or you can have some exogenous hints that larger development, but then you can have an exogenous measures that can help. And an exogenous measure can also be, like in the south working, for instance, phenomenon in Italy, that people coming from the south of Italy, coming back to the south, that moved, migrated to the north of Italy, north of Europe, then started to do something in the remote, for instance, areas in the south. So this is exogenous, because it's true that they were coming from that areas, but then they studied abroad and they are bringing back something that they learned somewhere else. I'm doing a study with a colleague from the UK about the role of remote workers and digital nomads in Italy. And what we found is that the share of remote workers and digital nomads is higher in less central areas, in remote areas that are more beautiful from the environmental point of view, coastal areas in the south and so on. But what we don't know from the survey and what we are going to explore is whether and how these people, exogenous people, because have participated in the, let's say, in the initiatives addressed to the local context to improve the socio-economic context. We don't know about this yet. So there is also this risk, that these people are exogenous people that just want to stay in a nice place and don't care about the local development or cultivation, or the other way around. I don't know. I would like to know what is your feeling about the Netherlands.
So I would say networks are there always. So they are not built by entrepreneurs. You're always in a network. But of course, entrepreneurial activity can change the network or can strengthen relations, can make them more dense or more, can push places more to the center. But what I find interesting about the district economics is that it's actually a collective endeavor. It's not the singular entrepreneur, but it's a collective entrepreneurial, or it's a sub-network of entrepreneurs, which then changes the overall network. I would also think that people coming from the south, coming back to the south, I would consider examples of nexogenous, because they come back, and also the example that you had of the investment in Messaloni is very interesting. In Japan, you have the option to pay part of your taxes to the place of origin as a kind of loan, which is interesting. But and I think that I would like to know more about that. The example of the digital nomads is interesting, I find, because they go. But what they do underline is that many of the places which seem to be abandoned and to be unworthy to investment are actually have a lot of value, because and are attractive. They offer a quality of life. What is a bit at the same time morally a little bit complicated is that they offer a quality of life for those who do not depend on local employment. So they are what I call colonizers in the sense of bringing a lot of, and then they profit from the environment. Could they, yeah, it depends on, so they probably contribute to the local economy by renting houses and by buying food. So they do contribute to the economy in some sense. I would be very interested to know if they engage, because I'm afraid that they very often do not, because that's not what they are interested in. But they use the place. That's in the term utilize the environment for their own. Maybe they are not even aware of it. I don't know. So they are in a way also. So if we, and that points to a very interesting, also theoretical questions, because very often when we consider who is a resident is very often considered to be somebody who lives already a long time, and we have this idea that they live there forever, which is of course not true for all rural areas. And we tend to forget people who are not officially registered, which is true for migrant workers. It's certainly for illegal, but also for European migrant workers. Normally don't need to register, depending on how long they stay. It's not true for tourists, even if they come regularly or live there half of the year. And it's also probably not true for digital nomads. So they are there, they are actors, but they are never considered in terms of social innovation or civic initiative. So it's very interesting that you look into that. And I could imagine that it could be nurtured, that it could be developed. So that, for instance, if you start the Creative Hub, some of the digital nomads have probably knowledge that is of interest, which could be, I don't know, whatever they do. It could at least be some level of ICT and some language, but maybe also entrepreneurship or something else. But it doesn't happen a lot. But what I was doing a part of the Camino this summer in France, and there were these places, villages of 300 residents with at least 7 places where you could stay overnight for pilgrims. Which was interesting, I find, because of course it brings money and some of the people who would offer that were newcomers. So they came from elsewhere, bought an empty shop and started a hostel. So, and they made money out of it. I don't know to what, it changed because it brought newcomers, so it brought maybe also young families. But how to understand that is I don't know. So it's similar to a digital nomad. You're a nomad without digital. So you walk every day and you're passing by, but you're also an actor. And is that bringing profit? I know in this Kinesis project we have a case in Spain where the village was interested to consider to what extent it was worthwhile profiting from the pilgrims, or if it would change their village. So if they should organize more activities to attract them, because this is the Aragonese route where few people walk, but you could, could attract them and keep them, but that might also change. And then the question, what is it that you want as a rural villager? And I also find that, I'm not, intriguing. So of course it seems to be logic to think rural development, endogenous development should be about what people want. So in that sense, democratic, participatory, but do they own the village? Is it actually really totally up to them? Is it not also, could it not also be, and then for a village maybe it's easier, what about sustainable energy? Where to produce that? And of course, I would say, I don't have the right to decide where windmills are built, but on the other hand, I think we do need them. We need to change to other sources of energy, and we need to decide where to put them. Can then every rural resident say, no, not here? Is that their fundamental right? What about then our collective interest of sustainable energy? Or has every farmer the right to decide whether or not to use pesticides because that's his business? I don't think so. So there are very difficult political and moral questions, ethical questions to decide who has the right to define needs and to make sure that they are realized.
Okay, I think that we have
Here's a kind of
time
question,
for
but I
two
don't.
more questions from
Yeah.
Michael.
I have a comment and a question. Comment building on what you were saying now and what Vasilis was saying, that all this quantification and somehow mercantilization of the services, that there are solutions that feel right within the current context, but I'm very wary of, because I feel like you always lose with that in that game. You will never you save grounds for Google, and Google will buy. You can quantify the services women are creating, but you will never be able to quantify every single thing. And do we want that? And is that a game that? So at the end of that, like, how would we change the perspective of this? Although I understand that there is a short-term ramification of these kind of approaches. And also, like what you're saying right now, and actually it kind of even within, I mean, I don't know the specificities of the initiative that you mentioned, which sounds very good, but it's also the people about owning the land, the common owned land. That people were involved into deciding whether they wanted a data center or not, and deciding whether that was a need or it was terrible. And because that can also be perceived as a colonization from the environments, urban, from the city that are consuming all this data, but they don't want, and it can be even very cynical, right? And I've experienced myself all this like super complexity, and going into the question of this complexity of urban areas need to stay the way they are, but they are already lost. And I'm thinking a lot about Spain, where I'm from. They need regeneration. Like there are places where they're already in a cycle that it cannot just be kept. It needs to be regenerated. And in order to regenerate it, you need new people. And a lot of times that people is not the people from the town that locals would like to see. You know, the kids of the kids, whatever. And a strong opposition or pushback and a cultural conflict between people coming in, whether the best intentions of the world. You know, you will never, ever be a local. Maybe you keep if you have a son born in the place, etc. So my question is, and their working spaces fit, and that is actually I'm interested in my own research. What do you consider that, setting aside digital nomads, where I think it's a different thing, and not talking about the suburban, close to the city processes, but this counter-urban migration of knowledge workers, neo-rurals, retirees, retired people, etc., fit, how much they can contribute to this, what are the key leverages to actually not end up creating a divided society where you have the locals and the rich, arrogant, urbanized that come to do, and do you think that collaborative working spaces can have a fit there, or do you know interesting experiences, or how do you envision the future in the long term with all these changes?
Yeah, again, it's there are different realities. So I think there are places where with urban newcomers, and very often retired, in the Netherlands, very often retired people, who integrated perfectly well, who were attracted by this sense of community, who came not just for the landscape and the house, but really wanted to make a difference and be part of a community. And they missed that community in the urban, and they wanted to contribute. And they became a member of associations. And they are often also valued because they have this, often they are highly educated because they can afford houses, that bring loads of experience, loads of networks, and know how to develop projects, to get leader money, and to get this kind of money, which is nice. But very often they also go to villages which were beautiful to start with. So they don't go to these mining villages where there is nothing in terms of amenities, or very little social, or very little educational capital. So the difference come bigger. What I have also seen in Spain is that sometimes newcomers are migrants from Morocco or from a different culture, which is not even digital nomads. But they really change, or are experienced as changing the village, or in Italy from Africa. Sometimes experienced as, or Albanians in Greece a long time ago. Sometimes experienced as strangers, and then you can divide it. Can have divided villages, but in some cases they also when they participate and when they reopen shops, when the schools can open again. And there was this example also in the south of Italy where the mayor, he was criminalized. So there, it is possible, but there it takes a lot of, I would say, maybe it takes this kind of hubs in terms of bringing people together, to learn together, to develop projects together, to not be experienced as a taking over. There's also, I had a master students doing research in Tuscany. I forgot the name of the place. Also a village with lots of migrants coming in. There is a very interesting Italian concept, restanza.
Sì. Vito Detti. Yes.
Which is really, restanza means stay in a way, but it has also the notion of resistance. So in restanza is decide to stay, but it's also the decide to resist against forces that try to undermine a community or try to undermine the future. And in that village, they also had a center with all kind of creative center. It closed down because it had problems with it was also about refugees integration, and then the Italian politics changed and they had to close down. But they had like a theater, a teatro povero, so it's like a creative theater to bring people together in the village, which existed, I think, from 40s or 30s. And they had also a history of integrating mental patients when the psychiatric clinics closed in Italy. So I think you can have that function as a creative hub, but depending on what kind of circumstances you have to develop activities. And if the newcomers are very strange, or you experience a kind of cultural difficulty, then you have to maybe organize different kind of projects. And again, it's probably very important to start from what is there, instead of offering the regular kind of courses in, I don't know, English language, cooking. Although cooking is often thought of as a very good way to overcome cultural differences. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, do you think that that is going to be a key factor in the future of development of rural areas? Is counter-urban migrants, and now focusing more on this rural creative class, knowledge workers, remote workers?
So if what is going to be a coordinating factor?
If they are going to play an important factor in rural development of these areas.
These creative hubs, you mean?
The migrants.
Or the migrants?
The migrants, but I'm talking more on the creative class style of migrants, not the
labor migrants.
International migrants that usually do more manual and low-skilled jobs. But in terms of bringing more innovation, higher income activities, etc., or it might be, because there's a lot of buzz, I feel, is yet to see if actually that is going to happen. And we've been hearing this for many years. And I don't think that has picked up. Maybe now after COVID and
That's a difficult question. I do think, but so I'm a very optimistic person. And I have the idea or the feeling that the experience of COVID has changed the vision of the rural at least a little bit, in the sense of it not being just hinterland, but attractive places. Again, you do see a selectivity in which places are considered as nice places to go to. And of course, one of the problems of the creative class is that they need digitalization. So the creative class with the exception of a single traditional painter, want to have high-speed internet, which is already a selection. It's one of the things the European Union wants to invest in. Yeah, what I think is important is to recognize that rural areas are not hinterland, but are part of. In Dutch, you have also the term, it's dialect, ommeland, which is the land around you. Which has it could say it's just a different word, but it does have a different sense. So if it's the land around us, it's part of our land in terms of our responsibility. And then you can, it's also part of your horizon, where you could move or where you could be. And maybe you can be there and contribute, not just as a consumer, because that's the problem of space of consumption, is if you just eat it and you don't care what is left behind. But if it's a space of co-production and co-creation and responsibility, then it's different. I think it's a new, it could have a future in an optimistic way if it is also a new way of life, not just for the singular artist and the singular person, and not just a life, not just a consumption, but more, You will find out.
Very last question. You
I have maybe easier question regarding the direction of research that you proposed. Could you go back to your last slide? So I'm wondering, I didn't quite fully get it, saying to have see the network more relational, but I wonder if you refer to shifting perspectives in our objective in research and how we see the position of nodes in this network, or do you refer more to trying to shift the position of nodes in network in reality?
I don't know if I understood your question. So it's about
unravel the moving relational web. Do you refer to change our perspective at who should be the objective in our research, who should be the main character in our research, or do you refer to more trying to move that in reality?
I think I meant it more in terms of research. So you have to, with that zooming in and zooming out, so you can zoom into local places and try to understand the dynamics in terms of civic initiatives or creative hubs and what they do to the place, but you need also to zoom out to see how that relates to what is happening elsewhere. And if positions are, if it helps to shift positions of the place in relation to other places.
Yeah, and I wonder if there's would there be some challenge to justify then in this way the network that we refer to in research, and then also the action network that's in reality? Like, for example, the political parties involved in one singular research may be different from the action political parties involved in the movement of a place. And I wonder, in research, how do you justify your scope of network?
That's difficult to give a general answer to that question. What I find always very important is that you can explain the urgency of your question. So which question what is your question of research, and why is that your question of research? So what is the problem? I always start with what is the problem? What is it that you want to understand or change, or what do we know already? So if given that, you define your question with sub-questions, and that can very well be about a local phenomenon, because that is what you, so if you want to understand to what extent digital nomads contribute to the development of a place or a community, you have to look into the places, probably to different places, and you have to select these different places. Maybe you need to take account of the network in order to select which places to compare. Or if you want to understand how a creative hub functions, the same, so that you want to understand it in a place. But why this place? And often there are pragmatic reasons, because that's where you can, it's not too far, or whether you know somebody, or because they speak your language, or whatever. That's fine, but you need to also have some theoretical or problem-based reason. And there, the zooming out is important. So this, why compare these places, or why focus on this particular place? Because it's a poor place, or if you just take a place, you need to understand how this place relates to other places and matters in terms of your problem. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, it does. It sounds like a general question, but I think in the process of research, so often that we have some reason, but then you find something else interesting, and then
but again, I know that. So it's about you need to. So you should do your PhD on a question that you find interesting, because even 3 years can be boring if it doesn't interest you. And that's fine. Recognize that there are personal motives or pragmatic motives, but then try also to, you need also to justify it scientifically and so socially, I would say. And that sometimes is also, you're very often, so if you have an academic mind and you're curious, there is generally a reason why you're curious. So it's not so personal or don't worry that it could not also matter theoretically or scientifically, but you need to figure that out to argue about it. And pragmatism is fine. Everybody needs to be pragmatic.
Okay, thanks very much, Bettina.
Thank you.
We are about 20 minutes ahead of time, so let's say that we made 15 past 12 here for the